Here we go, everybody. It's another show with Ron, and I'm Ron, where we try to add some context and commentary to the news, see if we can kind of make sense of the broad outlines of what we're being fed. And the big news that everybody's making the most of, even Drudge, who I'm kind of explaining here on the site most of all, we have the verdict against Trump. And this was a bookkeeping case, and they got him, and they got him good. So, whether you're a nut or whether you're a legitimate different thinker, if you come into the public sphere and you don't keep your books correctly, they will come after you. And this, now, I'm not a court follower. I don't try to get online and parse every little thing that's happening in a court case and try to predict it to my own preset audience that wants it to go one way or another. I'm looking at it from a distance because I think you can't really do that predictive stuff unless you're right there in the courtroom, hearing everything, understanding the procedure. But what we can do is say that this is probably another kind of unforced error by Trump. I think he'd be the first one to say he knows they're out to get him. We've already been through the one presidency of Trump. He had some ability to change things, not much, but he does face a media that says he's a danger. Here's Stormy Daniels, the person who was paid off in these payments, warning the world he's completely and utterly out of touch with reality. But, all of this we heard the first go around when he was, before he was elected president. One thing that's different here, and I follow Drudge because many years ago, I was there when the internet was getting big in the 90s, and the Drudge was a very early website, and it forced the media to cover some stories about Clinton that the media had decided not to cover. And over the years, the Drudge Report was criticized as pushing forward right-wing or at least Republican talking points. And certainly before the first election of Trump in 2016, this site was considered to have gone easy on Trump, but not this time around, and actually not in the last election in 2020 either. And so here we have this Drudge Report, the news aggregation site, really pumping up all of the negative headlines, and they are legitimately negative news for the United States that it's come to this. Throughout the big media in the United States, we have a lot of explanation and a lot of people seeming to crow about these verdicts. I may be completely wrong, but I thought before this there was a different version of this article, slightly worded differently, that seemed to conflate all of Trump's cases together to make it sound even worse than it already was. But here CNN is attempting to explain its 34 counts of falsifying business records in a hush money trial. You always add that because it makes it sound worse, although other presidents have openly paid that, like Clinton. But see, he apparently accounted for it properly. See, when you know they're after you, when you're the person who's saying they're after me, you better make sure that you're clean as a bean. And there's other charges that they're lumping on him, certainly from a lot of places in the American political sphere. They would like to sideline Trump from even running for president through these court cases. And it can be seen like that. And of course, you can also say quite legitimately that nobody should be above the law. Just because you're saying you're running for president, you shouldn't not have to face these things. And this is the question of the hour. This was a little before the verdict. No, I guess it was a week ago. But how much are Americans going to pay attention to the verdict? And until the verdict came out, it just seemed like another in a long line of charges or threats of charges, throughout the whole, when President Trump was president from 2016 to 2020, there was an endless stream of media that seemed to say he was about to be charged, and even after he was out of office. And so it was only recently, very coincidentally now, in the lead up to this election, suddenly this avalanche of charges broke through, and they're all coming to fruition right during the election year. Well, I'm coming back to this. In the last show we talked about the contrasts in the political positions of Biden and Trump. And, it got me to thinking about the old concept of, I don't know if it's a concept or I made it up. It's the genius of nations that can survive. Part of the genius of the nation is they give the nation or the world the right person at the right time to deal with the issue at hand. And that person may not be suitable at any other time. Like Great Britain, we have Winston Churchill. It's a politician involved in a lot of things, a lot of years, but then in the lead up to World War II and throughout that period, he was the right person to guide the populace of voters to making the hard choices and following through on the hard decisions. And the United States has had that way as well. Maybe only in retrospect. You look back and you see a Lincoln who kind of a minor politician who came to prominence during the Civil War time. And certainly, if you read about him, he made a lot of mistakes, a lot of weird decisions in retrospect. But ultimately, he had the right temperament, the right leadership. He was the right person that was dealt out of history to the United States to keep the Union together at that time. And we go further to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, like Churchill, he was the right person to guide the United States through the World War II, those difficult times. And probably as important as that, he integrated a lot of socialist ideals into American culture, our Social Security, our pension plan, this sort of thing. Therefore, kind of neutering any socialist dogma that might have grown up in the wake of the Great Depression. And arguably, you can go forward to the 80s and say that, in 1980, there's over 20% inflation in the United States. Employment was high. Even the old American dream of owning a house was essentially gone. And you have a person who is dealt like a Reagan, who was just restoring the United States economic base and restoring its position in the world in terms of being the arbiter of the world order. Now, you might agree with that. A lot of people don't agree with that anymore, but that's what happened. Reagan's time wasn't a time where people were saying, what can we do for the poor people or the disadvantaged? It was just like, what can we do for the whole country to get it back to normal? And Reagan set the tone of that internationalism, free trade, that went forward for 40 years, really all the way up to about 2016 and Trump. Of course, you look at the Clintons, they're essentially continuing those Republican policies of internationalism and sensible economic policy. Of course, the Clintons had the most sensible economic policy at all. They balanced the budget in the 1990s, and now we're way past that. In the last 20 years, that's all fallen apart. So we come to Trump, and we come to a time where everything has changed. People don't believe in internationalism anymore. They don't believe in America being involved as the world policeman, either financially or directly with the wars. You know, early in the 2000s, we had the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, which dragged on as wars do. And I think, you know, President Bush at that time didn't do a good job in leading or explaining what the American public was doing there, why the money was going in there for those wars. And the populace was kind of educated by the media at that time that wars were bad. And then we had another President Obama, and he started another war in Libya. And, you know, from a certain viewpoint, if I put on my hat of a 1980s person of that era, I would say there's certain reasons why the United States should be the world policeman and intervene here, here, and here. But times change. And I don't, you know, see, some people would say Trump is the great man that history has dealt to us at this time, at this troubled time. But Trump's already been president, and we know how that is. It's not the end of the world, but it's a lot of chaos. I would say now the time that we are in is the crisis time. And sometimes we have very unsuitable people during those times. Sometimes before the great man who is dealt to us, or the great person. You know, before the Civil War, we had, I think, was it James Buchanan, considered one of the worst presidents, sat on his hands, didn't do anything. In the height of the 60s, 68, which, and you see one of my previous videos, I kind of compare some of the times that today echo a little bit of the feelings of the late 60s. In the late 60s, we had LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, little remembered or thought about now, kind of considered a failed presidency. To me, he's one of the most interesting presidents of modern times, because if you read about him, it's a fascinating study of the best intentions can go terribly wrong, how the United States essentially fooled itself into greater and greater involvement in Vietnam, in disastrous economic policies towards the poor at home. And those carried on into the next presidency, which was Nixon. You know, we are in a crisis, sort of a crisis state, low faith in institutions. And I would say it probably is the case with both Biden and Trump. These are two men who are not right for the time, but they're speaking to the aspirations of many. So we come back to this, and we talked about this in the previous show here. This is comparing the policies, and I don't know. I'm not a historian, but I would just say I can recognize two broad times of presidential policy or promises, and one is during a time where there's no crisis, and another is during a crisis time where presidential policies have to only react to what's happening in the world. So, for instance, during the Clintons' time, during Hillary Clinton's failed election for presidency in 2016, these were more peaceful times. And so we would see campaign promises about how to spend big amounts of money. Like, oh, we're going to spend $1 trillion to rebuild America's crumbling infrastructure, its crumbling roads and bridges. Or we're going to roll out a universal health care plan, or we're going to roll out these programs for young children, blah, 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 this sort of a thing. And if you remember, and I don't know why I remember this so vividly, you know, in 2016, during Hillary Clinton's, the Democratic convention, they had this long kind of cadence of bringing up different peoples who were so oppressed by the U.S. system. And then at the end of it, they'd say, but Hillary has a plan. She has a plan. It's you know, a lot of handouts and programs and things. And that's what you can do during a time when there's not the wars and the rumors of wars as we have now. Compare that to, excuse me, compare that to this kind of rundown of the campaign positions and promises today. It's their reactions to stuff that's happening in the world. History has grown too big, so we can't just talk about spending money. It's all about how do we react to stuff happening? How do we react to changes in the abortion law? How do we react to stuff that's happening in the climate? This is more stuff Trump's doing. How do we react to the huge amounts of immigration that are going on in the world? How do we react to the foreign wars? This is the sort of thing. How do we react to changes in societal acceptance, stuff that's happening in the Ukraine? So this is different than in the time of peace, where you only have just thinking about ways to spend money in programs to help people. A good president, if you want to know about this, Teddy Roosevelt. So he had hoped to be I guess a big ego, obviously. He'd hoped to be a president during a time of crisis so he could show how great leader he was or whatever. But he was a president in a time of relative peace where he wasn't having to react to the world. So he had to find other ways to show leadership and that sort of a thing. So that's sort of been on my mind. What is history dealing us? Is it dealing us the great man for the time or the wrong men for the time? And I think it's probably the latter, most definitely. And this is something that's quite interesting that I saved and I forgot about. This is a famed Democratic strategist, James Carville. This is the guy associated with Bill Clinton in the 90s, brought him to power by capturing the middle, the voters, and bringing people who you would think that were unshakably Republican in previous times. So he's talking about, you know, the leftist, the polarization of politics, which is antithetical to what presidential politics has been in past decades, that it's capturing the middle again. If you look at the past show, I talk about this more as well. You know, he's criticizing stuff like the ridiculous student debt forgiveness package. You know, this is for the rich or the super rich who have immense amounts of money to pay every year to college, to somehow lock these people into voting for him. They wanted to forgive the student debt. I never got to do that. I had to pay all of it back. There's nothing in this for me. It's and it's just seems to be this policy that has been such a thing in the Democratic Party for a few years now. Why that is, it's just catering to the already wealthy, and it's ridiculous. So why are we forgiving student loans for people who go to Harvard, this sort of a thing? And instead, it's something I've kind of harped on. If you watch all the shows I've talked about, The real issue, and he points it out here, is the economy and inflation. And there's two things. There's what's happening in real life, which is economy, inflation, which real people can recognize, and they see it in their life. And then there's how the media is trying to kind of spin that. And the media, which by and large supports the Democratic Party, has been trying to say it's not as bad as you think. All the numbers are good. They even came up with that phrase, which I made a big deal of, called the vibe economy. All at once, all of the big news outlets started talking about the vibe economy. This was to explain that if you thought it cost too much to buy a bag of Doritos, you're just mistaken. Things are wonderful. And I think as Democrats should not be blinded by their own propaganda that's coming out of supposedly impartial news sources, because people can see that groceries are expensive, and that impacts them, and they do see effects of immigration as well. A different policy in this presidency, more open borders than ever before, and there are lots of reasons that came from the right wing for years and years about free markets and open borders are good, and I think those remain true for when you're looking at decades. But the Democrats should be afraid that immigration in an election year, it's a populist issue that can really be used against them, and they've got to be aware of that. I don't know. It's just, what a great title. Why survivors of a nuclear World War III will envy the dead. So, I think I had something to say about this, but I can't remember what it is. But again, this is a wonderful headline. Wonderfully horrible. I remember. Okay, see, I had to pause for a second to remember. So I wanted to compare and contrast, give context to the way we think about nations and freedom now and the way we thought about it before the end of the Cold War in 1989, 1990. So when the Cold War was still in full effect, and when the whole world was hemmed up in this doctrine of MAD, mutual assured destruction, we had the USSR and the US, on a hair trigger at any point, someone would send off nukes, and the other side would have to send off nukes or risk having their entire defense and offense obliterated on the ground. So it meant that if anybody used nukes, it was the end of civilization. And during that time, the idea towards freedom and democracy was it really didn't matter that much. We just had to have peace at any cost with the Soviet Union. We just had to say they have kids and they want to take care of their kids, and we have them. We just have to find some middle ground. And this came up in my mind because I was reading Watchmen again, the old graphic novel. And in that, we have this gambit to try to stop an imminent nuclear war between the United States and the UK, but through this whole crazy thing that involves a giant squid. But the upshot of it was nobody at that time was saying, well, what about all those people who were enslaved in a totalitarian, authoritarian regime in the UK? Can't we free them? Nobody ever thought about that because the bigger issue were nukes, peace at any cost. And I also remember the old Dr. Seuss book, the Butter Battle book, which even at the time I thought it was terribly offensive because it said, it mimed what conventional wisdom and popular culture said up through the 80s, that we can't judge a totalitarian state like the Soviet Union. It's just the only difference between the liberal Western democracies and what's happening behind the Iron Curtain is they butter their bread on one side and we butter on the other. And that was what the fighting was in the Butter Battle book by Dr. Seuss. And it just said we just have to accept that they're different. Some people are going to live under slavery, some are under peace. And that seemed to be a logical thing, by and large, during a time of mutual assured destruction. Now, after the end of the Cold War, people were like, oh, wow, well, let's turn everybody democratic, capitalistic, get them into free trade agreements. And it was like that for almost 30 years. And we're coming into a different time where people aren't as enamored of free trade anymore. And the specter of nuclear war and mutual assured destruction is rising again. And what I wonder, and when I see headlines like this pop up, and this was just one of several that was on the Drudge report, it makes me wonder if we will get back a little bit away from insisting that Russia become democratic or that anybody become democratic and go back to the Cold War era idea of just saying we need to have peace at any cost. We can't risk civilization. We're just going to have to find a way to live and let live, and say that freedom or slavery is just a piece of bread buttered on one side or the other. Now, after the Cold War, that kind of seemed crazy. But when you're in that, it kind of made practical sense. So that's my, it's kind of a heavy thought to end on. We'll get this one too. Next generation of Internet of Bodies could meld tech and human bodies together. And here's what I say. I say any trend does not go out to infinity forever. And my example of this is years ago when boingboing.net was not this weird political website full of advertisements. It was just tech news, very, very good. Sort of like slashdot.org, a little more upscale. And they had some posts that showed what life would be like in the 70s. And it showed a living room completely made of plastic and the housewife spraying it down with a hose. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. In fact, the 60s happened, and people turned out of the plastic fantastic lifestyle, of the artificiality. They went back to nature. And the lesson of that post was that it's a mistake that any trend goes out to infinity, that there will be a swinging of the pendulum, so to speak. And so let's take that to this, that says that our tuned in TikTok lifestyle is going to just completely envelop us in AI slop and will become part of the internet. And I'm theorizing that perhaps we are, along with everything else we've talked about, are at this inflection point where people will start to say, I'm not interested in being online all the time. I'm not interested in have to use a banking app on my phone for anything. I don't want to be tuned in to all this advertising on the net. So what I'm saying, maybe the pendulum is going to swing back and people are no longer going to want to be plugged in all the time. And we'll go back to maybe some 16-bit computers, maybe with some rudimentary messaging, and that's all. No more putting so much garbage and having to consume it all the time. Anyway, that's a theory. Some pendulum swinging back. Before I go, speaking of some of these themes that... this is my book, my latest book, novel. There Are Still Unknown Places. It's for sale on Amazon Kindle. It's about people who go far away to find themselves, to find a future, to escape from the future. I, in my hubris, think it's perhaps something like Paul Bowles' The Sheltering Sky. And this is contrasting our little insignificant lives with the sweep of history, and yet not judging our lives, because our lives are all that we have and they are our own eternity. So please read this. It's in bookstores in Thailand, in Asia Books, and Books Kino. And also, my book of short story memoirs from a few years ago just came out in a paperback form. It's also in bookstores in Thailand. This is where I'm not just writing like a long diary where I'm the hero of every story. I'm trying to put the discipline of the short story to a memoir to create something that captures, again, the tone of the time and the feeling how things were at a certain point. So it's also on Amazon as well. So anyway, that's the news for today. A lot of heavy news. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like and subscribe. Because I talk about political issues on this, I can't promote it through YouTube because it's considered election advertising. So please share this around. I try to add some insight, and I will have another show in a few days, hopefully. Until then, bye-bye.